Chapter 56. Transportation. Section 5. Those who delight to distinguish practical wisdom from theory will derive no countenance from the early practice of transportation. To rid the parent state of an encumbrance was alone the immediate object of the government. All beyond was surrendered to fate. The absorbing agitation of Europe, then filled with wars and revolutions, diverted the public gaze from a distant experiment and left to local discretion the details of its working. The difficulties of this extempore system were really great. That competition for penal labor, which afterwards made its distribution a boon, had no existence. The social influence of a strong body of settlers, habituated to industry and expecting opulence as its reward, was an auxiliary unknown. Political economy, as a practical science, was lightly esteemed. The choice of instruments to effect a royal purpose, rarely determined by their specific qualifications. The first rulers of these colonies were indeed men of literary pretensions, several of extensive nautical experience, trained on the quarter-deck in the discipline of war, when royal ships were often scenes of great courage and of equal despotism and debasement, when seamen were taken from the dock, impressed from the trader, and even stolen on the streets. Taught to govern a crew, they were judged by the ministry exactly qualified to coerce and control a body of prisoners. There were some advantages in this choice. They were men who knew how to subject the will of masses. Their fearless temper felt no dread of those wild and lawless spirits surrendered to their power. They could transfer the system of the navy to the shore. They were not intimidated by hardships, and they were accustomed to privations. Perhaps no other profession could have furnished adventurers, on the whole, so well qualified for their task. But in planting a colony, tillage is the first element of success. Of this, they knew nothing. They could destroy a fort or erect a tent, but to subdue the earth to the plough or to construct a town required another education. They gave, and long preserved, to the site of the city the name of camp. Thus the first efforts at cultivation were unfortunate. They had passed 2 years in New Holland, scratching up the earth with hoes, and ought to have gathered a harvest, when they were on the verge of starvation. Among the 1,000 persons landed, not one could be found possessing a knowledge of agriculture. What they did not know, they could not teach. The misapplication of labor was prodigious. They acquired the art of cultivation by the slow process of experiment, and thus they came to a conclusion, only lately obsolete, that an Australasian husbandman is spoiled by the agricultural knowledge of Europe. The immediate direction of labor from the beginning was committed to convicts. To stand over the prisoners was not an agreeable occupation for gentlemen. Thus, the actual working of transportation as a penal system was entrusted to men, often clever and corrupt, whose brutal habits and savage demeanor excited disgust and fear. This error perpetuated itself. Persons of character rejected a position so often occupied by the worthless. Even the distribution of labor was entrusted to such hands, or subject to their influence. To the prisoners, in reality, they sold indulgences of the crown or exacted a revenue from their vices. The chief superintendent of convicts at Sydney, and who long determined what men should be dispatched to this country, was himself doubly convicted. This was far from destroying eligibility. It became at last an official proverb that bad men, from the very vices of their character, were the fittest for a direct supervision, and finally that the world is divided between the rogue and the fool. The use of power, when entrusted to such hands, is no problem, nor is it possible to imagine greater degradation or punishment more capricious than of the unfortunate person subject to such taskmasters, in whose hands, according to the custom of early times, the rod of authority was not a metaphor. That form of service, known as assignment, was established by Governor King in 1804. The master was bound by indenture to retain his servant for 1 year, and for every day deficient, a penalty of 1 shilling was imposed. The quantity of the work to be done was prescribed, contingent, however, on the nature of the soil, the state of the weather, and the strength of the workman. The surplus of his time might be occupied by the master, but his earnings were his own. Wages were £10 per annum, and for a female £7, but the deficiency of money induced the employers to allot a proportion of time as a compensation, or to supply goods on which an advance was claimed, often extremely oppressive. and when the season rendered servants less useful, the masters were tempted to obtain relief by false accusations, or to allow their men to quit the premises, who sought, by labour or theft, the means of subsistence. To restrict the habit of change, Macquarie established the rule that no convict should be returnable, except for infirmity, sickness, or crime. But when the supply exceeded the demand, this condition was evaded, and the result, an accumulation in the hands of the government. A large proportion were from the manufacturing districts of Great Britain. They were utterly ignorant of farming, and when the plough superseded the hoe, they required a tedious training before they repaid the expense of their support. The agriculture of this colony was long trifling. The convicts were chiefly employed as stockmen and shepherds. From the banks of the Derwent to the district of Launceston, the land in general was a wilderness, unfenced and untenanted. The men, stationed 40 and 50 miles from their masters' dwellings, were rarely visited and were under no immediate control. They were armed to defend themselves from the natives and clad in skins. They lived in turf huts, thatched with long grass, and revived the example of savage life. It was the custom to allot to the superior officers, magistrates, and constables, in proportion to their rank, a certain number of men who were subsisted from the king's stores. A skilful mechanic or peddler was a valuable acquisition. He hired his own time and paid from 5 shillings to £1, according to its estimated weekly value, while the master drew, for his own use, the rations of the servant. Others rented farms and paid their masters in produce, and when government men, as assigned servants were called, were unable to obtain payment and thus failed to make good an engagement with the master, they were liable to be thrown back into their former position. Tickets of leave were freely given to those incapable of much service to the government or its officers. Such as were useful, whatever might be their conduct, were long detained, and for a period often indefinite. Females who arrived with property were discharged to enjoy it. If followed by the husband, the wife was instantly assigned to his care. To enable a prisoner to support his wife when she joined him, or when a convict married a convict, if of no special value, he was released to labour for himself. No accurate account was preserved of these distributions, and a notice appeared during the government of Sorel, which required all women living at large to give an account of the grounds on which they pretended to freedom, or otherwise to obtain a regular ticket of leave. Under a system so irregular, great practical injustice was occasionally inflicted, while advantages were enjoyed by artisans who could hire their time, who obtained large profits from their trade, and indulged in every form of vice and licentiousness. An action in 1821, Loan versus Beaumont, for the recovery of a debt incurred by a prisoner of the Crown assigned to the defendant, illustrated the system which then prevailed. The man in question arrived in 1813, and in 1816 he was Beaumont's government man, who then by verbal agreement, and afterwards in writing, engaged to sell him a farm near Herdsman's Cove for £1,400, including the stock and implements of husbandry. He possessed, besides a sum of money, a considerable flock of sheep. There was nothing disguised in this transaction. The annual rental was intended to cover the purchase. The judge remarked that the memorandum was as good a sale upon honour as ever he saw. The suit was an instance of the strange perversion of prison discipline, which however excited no remark, and therefore could not be uncommon. At the close of Governor Davies' administration in 1817, the population of Van Diemen's Land was 3,114, and of these 566 resided in the county of Cornwall. The convicts were slowly augmented by deportations from Sydney, and they were subject to the absolute will of the officers. It is in vain to look for systems in a community so small and separated by so great a distance from public opinion. Management was lax or rigid, according to the temper of the moment, and no object was contemplated by those who had power except to render its exercise subservient to their private views. Previous character had no marked influence in determining the lot. A life of crime was no barrier to indulgence when its price could be paid. The early career of the prisoners was generally unknown. The discipline was, indeed, often severe. Lashes were administered by hundreds, and crimes or offences were resented or forgiven, not according to rule, but circumstances. There were, however, gradations of penal banishment. As at Sydney, Those separated to special punishment were sent to Hobart Town, such as were still further implicated were forwarded to Launceston. But the dregs of all settled at Georgetown. What was the character of the inhabitants of that place may be inferred from the Commissioner's reports. Prisoners, male and female, living in skillings, the commandant disobeying the orders of his chief, inferior officers exhibiting flagrant immorality, labour compensated by the government in a currency of rum, sold by abandoned women who were often the depositories of stolen goods passed from Hobart Town and Launceston. Such was Georgetown at, and for some time after, this era. The charges against the prisoners were such as result from slavery and debasement. All crimes of less magnitude than murder or burglary under aggravated circumstances were punished in a summary manner. To prosecute was to encounter ruin. The person despoiled, while pursuing the robber, lost the remnant of his property, and, returning to his dwelling, found it wrecked and pillaged. Mechanics and others entitled to money were paid in rum, and its prompt consumption was the only means to secure its enjoyment. Those who earned considerable sums were rarely richer than their neighbours. While Governor Collins lived, some order was maintained. It was during the rule of his successor that the British standard covered a state of society such as never before possessed the official sanction. Once or twice a month, this governor enjoyed a carouse, to which a seaport, in times of war, might furnish an example. Having selected a station not far from the town, he provided for the feast. The more talented of the convicts surrounded the tent and enlivened the entertainment with songs. Rum in large quantities loaded the board. First the chiefs and then their retainers revelled in its overflowing abundance. The jail gang, warned by his honour's steward of the direction the guests had taken, sometimes followed after the jovial ruler, and when the moon arose, the governor and his attendants of various grades might be seen winding home together. A number of settlers, whom he had offended, refused an invitation. When time had obliterated their resentment, he invited them again. The table was covered, and the guests were seated. But at that moment, the jail gang, facetiously called the governor's band, and who were posted near the spot for the purpose, burst into the chamber and swept away all the provisions. The governor pretended to regret this termination, but consoled himself by saying he could get a dinner at Stocker's. Such was this trustee of national justice. Footnotes. At the period above mentioned, the colony was in imminent danger of perishing from famine in consequence of the non-arrival of storeships from England. Captain Tench, in his interesting work on New South Wales, thus describes the situation and feelings of himself and his fellow settlers. We had now, that is, in the beginning of 1790, been 2 years in the country, and 32 months from England, in which long period no supplies, except what had been procured from the Cape of Good Hope, had reached us. Famine was approaching with gigantic strides, and gloom and dejection overspread every countenance. Still, we were on the tiptoe of expectation. If thunder broke at a distance, or a fowling piece of louder than ordinary report resounded in the woods, a gun from a ship was echoed on every side, and nothing but hurry and agitation prevailed. As we had removed from Botany Bay to Port Jackson, it was judged necessary to fix a party of seamen on a high cliff called South Head, at the entrance of the harbour, on which a flag was ordered to be hoisted whenever a ship might appear, which should serve as a direction to her and as a signal of approach to us. Here, on the summit of a hill, did we sweep the horizon every morning from daylight until the sun sunk, in the hope of seeing a sail. At every fleeting speck which arose from the bosom of the ocean, the heart bounded, and the telescope was lifted to the eye. If a ship appeared here, we knew that she must be bound to us, for on the shore of this vast ocean, the largest in the world, we were the only community which possessed the art of navigation and languished for intercourse with civilized society. In March, vigorous measures were become necessary. The Sirius was ordered to prepare for a voyage to China, but she was shortly after wrecked. On the 27th of this month, the following order was issued. Parole, honour, countersign. The expected supply of provisions, not having yet arrived, makes it necessary to reduce the present ration, to render the mentioned allowance to every person in the settlement without distinction. 4 pounds of flour, 2 pounds and a half of pork, and 1 pound and a half of rice per week. The flour was afterwards reduced nearly 1/2, and the other articles in a less proportion. The pork had been salted between 3 and 4 years, and every grain of rice was a moving body. We soon left off boiling the pork, as it had become so old and dry that it shrunk 1/2. We toasted it before the fire, catching the drops which fell on a slice of bread or in a saucer of rice. The distress of the lower classes for clothes was almost equal to their other wants. Nothing more ludicrous can be conceived than the expedients of substituting, shifting, and patching, which ingenuity devised to eke out wretchedness and preserve the remains of decency. Nor was another part of our domestic economy less whimsical. If a lucky man who had knocked down a dinner with his gun, or caught a fish by angling, invited a neighbor to dine with him, the invitation ran, "Bring your own bread." Even at the governor's table, this custom was constantly observed. Every man who sat down pulled his bread out of his pocket. In May, the men became much weakened from want, and they were ordered to do only as much work as their strength would permit. Rigorous justice was executed on persons detected in robbing or pilfering. A convict detected in stealing potatoes was ordered to receive 300 lashes, to be chained for 6 months to 2 other criminals, and to have his allowance of flour stopped for 6 months. Further, to contribute to the detection of villainy, a proclamation offering 60 pounds of flour, more tempting than the gold of Peru, was promised to anyone who should apprehend a robber of garden ground. At length, the bonds of misfortune began to separate, and on the evening of June 3rd, the joyful cry of "The flag's up!" resounded in every direction. I was sitting in my hut, musing on our fate, when a confused clamour drew my attention. I opened my door and saw women, with children in their arms, running to and fro, with distracted looks, congratulating each other and kissing their infants with the most passionate and extravagant marks of fondness. I ran to a hill where, by the assistance of a pocket glass, my hopes were realized. A brother officer was with me, but we could not speak. We wrung each other by the hand, with eyes and hearts overflowing. Finding the governor intended to go immediately in his boat down the harbour, I begged to be of his party. As we proceeded, the object of our hopes soon appeared, a large ship, with English colours flying, working in between the heads which form the entrance to the harbour. The tumultuous state of our minds represented her in danger, and we were in agony. The weather was wet and tempestuous, but the body is delicate only when the mind is at ease. We pushed through wind and rain, the anxiety of our sensations every moment redoubling. At last, we read the word London on her stern. "Pull away, my lads, she is from Old England. A few strokes more, and we shall be aboard. Hurrah for a belly full, and news from our friends." Such were our exhortations to the boat's crew. A few minutes completed our wishes, and we found ourselves on board the Lady Juliana transport, with 235 of our countrywomen, whom crime or misfortune had condemned to exile. She had been about 11 months on her voyage. Tench's narrative. End of chapter 56, being transportation. Section 5.